Hi, my name's Ashley, and I am going to be presenting on a complex coordinated terrorist attack, or a CCTA. Mine is a little bit unique compared to most of the others. I really wanted to do some kind of terrorist or active shooter event, and so I was able to do an international event, so it will be a little bit different because they don't use the ICS structure. But I chose the Madrid train bombings, otherwise known as 11M, and that's because they took place on March 11th, 2004 in Madrid, Spain. And the reason it's called a CCTA is because it was a series of improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, homemade bombs, that were placed on multiple different trains. So there were 4 different trains, and there were a total of 13 bombs, but only 10 of them went off. So during a Thursday morning commute in a busy city, that I got conflicting population info, but it's somewhere between 3 and 5 million in the city of Madrid, which is the capital of Spain. And the train system there holds over 700,000 people. And so between these 4 trains during a morning commute, it was about 7 a.m., 7:15 when the trains took off. There were thousands of people using the trains during that time. And so the first bombs went off at 7:38 a.m. and there were 3 bombs on that train. And then at 7:39 on the next train, 4 bombs went off. And then at 7:41, 2 more bombs, and then another at 7:42 on a different train. They did find that the trains that had the doors closed had the worst impact. They had much more pressure when the explosions went off, and so many more people died immediately on those trains where the doors were actually closed. So responders were coming to the site within 5 to 9 minutes of each explosion. And by 8 a.m., so about 20 minutes later, the hospitals were beginning to receive victims. So there were 15 major hospitals that were involved, in addition to some primary care offices and a field hospital. But the biggest source of medical care was through a hospital I cannot pronounce, but I'm just going to call it GMUH, and it was a teaching hospital that was just very close by, and it was also the largest hospital in the area with over 1,800 beds, and so they received over 50% of the victims coming from there, and it was close by. And so that started happening at 8 a.m. and they had a really good surge procedure. So they canceled all of their elective procedures. They discharged people that were in their emergency department with minor issues very quickly. They discharged people who were still admitted to the hospital but were going to be discharged that day anyway. They expedited that process, and then they triaged some of the minor injuries from the incident itself very quickly, and so they were able to make space and have hundreds of extra beds very quickly, even though the event was obviously unplanned. And so they use a system called PlatterCam, and it is their organizational framework for emergencies. And so by 9:15 a.m., they had activated their maximum level emergency code, which is a level 3, and began sharing that information with the other agencies. So there was a large network of emergency responders, including the Health Community Council of Madrid, the SUMA 112, plus their CSU, which is their Coordinating Services of Urgencies, and that is basically like their EMS department and their dispatch operators together. And then they have a civil protection service called SAMOR, and they also enlisted Red Cross responders and volunteer organizations, in addition to police and fire and rescue and then just citizens who happened to be at the site and were able to participate in helping. And so by 10:17, they had evacuated everyone from the site. So in under 3 hours, they had everyone off of the trains and being assisted in some manner. By 9 p.m., 77% of the victims had been treated at one of the hospitals or by some first responder in some way. So the victims were commuters from over 18 countries. So there were some communication issues just from having such a variety of people and languages, but also other communication issues, which I will bring up in a moment. Some other players who are notable would be the politicians, as this incident was actually later connected to political policies, foreign policies related to the Iraq War. And so they finally did find out that the people who planted these bombs were Muslim jihadists, and they had connections with Al-Qaeda, and were using this 3 days before a national election in order to inflict terror, but also make a statement about the policies by the person who was running. And so that actually was successful in a sense, because when that election happened 3 days later, they did vote for a new person to come in who was going to overturn all of those policies connected with the attack. So as I said, Madrid and Spain does not use the FEMA ICS system, so they have their system, which is the Territorial Plan of Civil Protection of Community of Madrid, which is the PLATER-CAM. And so unfortunately at this time, it was 2004, and emergency management has come a long way since then, but there was a lot more individual planning within agencies and not as much interagency coordination. And from all of the articles I read and a documentary that I watched and a congressional hearing that I watched, that is one of the biggest things I heard reiterated over and over, was just the lack of interagency coordination. Many of them had individual plans, but they were kind of doing things in those silos without knowing how to work together. And so a lot of the emergencies they were trained for also were more like everyday small scale emergencies. And since this was a mass casualty incident or an MCI, the functions needed to be adapted quite a bit, and they were not prepared for that. I found very little information on long-term recovery and other services post-event, so that's something that maybe was lacking, or maybe there just isn't a lot of written information on it. So as far as the participants' response, some of the things they did well included quick response times. So the emergency responders were at a shift change, and so there were actually a lot more responders on duty, and the same with the hospital, than would normally be on duty in the middle of a shift. So they were able to respond very quickly and mobilize a large number of responders at once. They were giving good quality care to the people they were able to get to, but unfortunately one of the issues was that there was an uneven distribution of care, and so I'll talk about that in a moment. Spontaneous citizen collaboration was something that was mentioned several times. So the victims who were involved, or people in the area that were able to participate, did rally very quickly and engage to give assistance. And then the first responders improvised very well. Also, not having a formalized interagency plan, they had to think on their feet a lot and make a lot of decisions, including transporting many patients to hospitals in private vehicles, etc. So some of the issues that I noticed reiterated in multiple different publications were the lack of mass casualty incident planning. And so, like I mentioned, they had more for everyday smaller emergencies, but not those large scale emergencies. And the plans that they did have in place had a lack of detail. So they were more general ideas of how to respond, but didn't have very detailed action oriented statements in them. And there wasn't a consistency of drills taking place to practice these. So some of the leadership knew what the steps were, but there wasn't a consensus among all of the staff knowing what steps needed to be taken once that emergency level was activated. Also, I mentioned the poor interagency coordination. So many of the organizations had their own plan, but because this was such a large scale, they didn't have something that was made for all of them to be able to work together. The lack of reliable interoperable communications was an issue at the bombing sites, so they had a lot of trouble communicating with the actual hospitals because they had to deactivate cell phone use because they were afraid it would trigger more explosions. And there was a very major lack of walkie-talkies or satellite phones or anything else except for what was inside the ambulance vehicles. And so that was a major issue. The uneven resource distribution had to do with a lack of a couple hospitals got over 1,000 people, and then other hospitals were only getting a few. And then also the standardized triage issues, so they were not using color-coded triage tags, and there was a lot of subjective use of how the order in which people were triaged. And so some people were getting a lot of resources and a lot of care while other people weren't getting any attention at all. And then a lack of clear command. So there were some leaders in place, but people were getting conflicting instructions from different people and not knowing who was actually in charge or what they should be listening to. And so there was a lot of redundancy in use of resources and people starting a task and then not being able to finish it because something had been moved or taken, or they got a new instruction from a different person. And then I did notice in a few places people mentioned a poor post-event analysis. So I think years later, people are going back and looking at it, especially in comparison to other major bombing events like 9/11 and the London tube bombings and other such events. But initially, poor post-event analysis and kind of an overconfidence and overestimation of the successes because people didn't want to talk negatively about what happened because everybody did the best they could. But that did lead to a lack of lesson learning initially, and where there could have been maybe more opportunity to implement those things that needed to be changed right away. So overall, there were 191 deaths and over 2,000 injuries. Only 14 of those deaths happened in the hospitals. The 177 initial deaths happened immediately from the explosions. So they did have a lot of success once they could get people alive to a hospital. They have increased interagency training and communication and emphasized the need for regular drills with all staff. And same with the interoperable satellite communications to be able to communicate in urban areas, especially. That is a common issue with bombing. That you can't use cell phones, so it's important to have those other options. And then creating a better clarity of command structure has been something they've been working on. And as far as I know, Madrid has not suffered another mass casualty incident on that level. And many of the lessons from Madrid have been used in other settings and in other countries since then. And yeah, so I think one of the big things, the color-coded triage system was something a lot of people talked about, really needing to have very standardized triage methods to make sure that the resources are being used as effectively as possible. And then I would like to highlight 2 resources if you're interested in learning more about this. There's a PBS documentary called America at a Crossroads. I think it's number 6. And then there's also a really long, like almost 3-hour congressional hearing on transit security, and they discuss this issue a lot because they did the hearing right after the London bombing, so it was just 1 year after Madrid, and they reference both of these if you're interested in learning more about this. Thank you.